Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Sunday morning Unitarian Universalist Community of Cleveland Community Forum. Unitarian Universalist Congregation welcomes you to this forum, and we're going to have a really nice program, and it's entitled Immigration, Refugees, DACA, and the Future. And to introduce our speakers, we have Laura M. Bornoni. Laura, you are still muted. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Please unmute yourself before you start. Good.
All good, and thank you. Good morning. Today's topic will throw some light on the current status of immigration policy and practice in the United States and in the Cleveland area. Normally, 3,000 immigrants come to Cleveland each year. In 2019, there were over 12,000 pending immigration cases in Cleveland courts. The words on the Statue of Liberty come to mind here. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. Not the sentiment we hear from many recently. Does the Biden administration offer opportunities to move toward greater fairness and kindness? Before I introduce the speakers, let me mention that questions from our audience will begin around 10 o'clock. If you have a question, type it in the Q&A section of the webinar. Look for a Q&A section. Probably if you have a PC at the very bottom of your screen, or if you have some other kind of device, it may be in some other location. Our speakers today can tell us about national trends and immigration in the greater Cleveland area. Patrick Kearns, Executive Director of Refugee Response, oversees educational and employment programs, as well as the nationally renowned Ohio City Farm. Presented with the Unsung Heroes of Compassion Award by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2014, Patrick has worked in Southeast Asia for 14 years prior to coming to the refugee response. Brian Hoffman also demonstrates compassion as an attorney specializing in immigration law. As one of 3 Ohio Supreme Court certified interpreters, Brian managed pro bono immigration cases in Texas and Georgia. He is now Executive Director of Ohio Center for Strategic Immigration Litigation. We welcome Brian Hoffman to begin our forum this morning. Brian.
Good morning, Laura. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you, yes.
Excellent. I just want to get started then with my presentation. And I want to go quickly into kind of the history of how we got to where we are, because we can certainly all agree that the information we get from the media about immigration is not necessarily positive most of the time. So I want to start by talking about the international system of protection that we have today. And a big part of that is the asylum laws of the United States. So asylum law is actually a direct response to the Holocaust, which is something that a lot of us don't necessarily understand. The international system of refugee protection actually started in the 1950s, but it was a response to events that happened specifically in 1939. I do a lot of presentations to undergraduates, and we always talk about the story of the MS St. Louis. It's sometimes called the Ship of the Damned. This was a ship of 900 refugees from Central Europe, mostly, who made it all the way across the Atlantic to the United States before their visas were canceled. They were refused entry to Cuba, the US, and Canada, and they were sent back across the Atlantic to Nazi Europe in the middle of 1939. Later scholarship showed that about a third of them perished during the Holocaust. So In response to the failures during the Holocaust to assist refugees, failures evidenced also by the fact that we denied visas to Anne Frank's family, the international community came together and passed what is known as the Refugee Convention. So there is an international treaty under the auspices of the UN. It's called the Refugee Convention. And the way this treaty is structured is that it's actually illegal for member states like the US to remove people to countries where their lives or freedom are in danger. So the language of international law is very clear. We cannot send people back to countries where their lives or freedom are in danger. And this is, I think, a recognition of the failures, not just of the United States, but of many Western and Western European countries to do enough during the Holocaust. United States law is also very clear. Per our own Constitution, any international treaties made are the supreme law of the land. So here you have it right now, Article 3 of the Refugee Convention and Article 6 of the Constitution. It is illegal under our own Constitution and international law to send people back to countries where their lives or freedom are in danger. There are a few other sources of authority that say the same thing: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man. Title 8 of the United States Code is where asylum protections are implemented into our own law. And of course, there are all kinds of sources of divine law from many different faith traditions that compel us to, in scriptural terms, treat the foreigners as we treat our own. So we have really solemn legal and moral obligations to protect people who come to us for help. But the devil, as they often say, is in the details. So the way that the United States immigration system is structured has a lot to do with how we are failing to live up to our international obligations in this area. So I want to do a quick refresher. This is just a Civics 101 overview. The US government has three branches: the executive, which houses all of the various federal agencies like the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security; the legislature, which is the two chambers of Congress; and then the judicial branch, which houses the Supreme Court, the various courts of appeals, and the US district courts. All of our immigration enforcement agencies are under the executive branch of our government. So within the Department of Justice, there is the Executive Office for Immigration Review, the Board of Immigration Appeals. There's about 60 courts and 350 judges throughout the US, including an immigration court right here in Cleveland, Ohio, that now has, I think, about 6 judges, almost all of them former prosecutors or former Homeland Security attorneys. So then within the Department of Homeland Security, you have various different enforcement agencies: customs enforcement, immigration enforcement, the Office of the Chief Counsel that represents the government in court. So the reason why a lot of the protections that we owe to people seeking asylum and refugee status are not really given meaningful effect is because all of the enforcement mechanisms in this country are the prerogative of the executive branch. Immigration courts are not actually part of the judicial branch of government. And it creates a system where, in effect, you have courts that act more as policy wings of an administration than they do as impartial adjudicators of the law. So to give you an idea, you do have some basic due process rights in immigration court. You do have the right to talk to a lawyer. They'll usually give you a little bit of time to try to find one. You can review some of the government's evidence against you, but not all of it. You can sometimes appeal, but the appeals are part of the same government agency. If you are demonstrably mentally ill, or if you are a very young child, in some cases you can be appointed an attorney, or you have other special rights. But what's more important is what's not a right in immigration court. If you are accused of being in the country without permission and sent to immigration court, it is nothing like a criminal due process in the US. So you don't have the right to an attorney. There are detention centers in this country where less than 5 or 6% of the people in the detention center have attorneys. You don't have the right to remain silent. They can use that against you if you don't answer a question. You don't have the right to review the government's file, the evidence they have against you. You can't confront your accusers. The formal rules of evidence don't apply. Hearsay doesn't apply. You have to pay for all of your own witnesses and legal representation. You're essentially also presumed guilty until proven innocent. You have to prove that you have the right to be in the country or that you deserve asylum. And you have to do that most of the time without a lawyer, because I can tell you, as someone who's practiced immigration law for almost 10 years, I could not afford my own services. We have a dramatic shortage of immigration lawyers in this country that is compounding the rights abuses in pretty serious ways. So you don't have the right to a lot of things in immigration court that you do in criminal court. And it gets worse because the immigration court for a long time has been manipulated by the executive branch. And you can see here very recently evidence that the judges who deny the most asylum claims overall are the ones who have been promoted to the appellate branch of our immigration courts. One of the other quirks of the system is that the Attorney General can issue his own decisions. A 3-member panel of the Board of Immigration Appeals could say, we think that victims of domestic violence deserve asylum. The Attorney General on his own can say, no, I'm going to reverse your decision, and essentially change the law. So this is, by its definitional structure, a very politicized system. And what we've seen is 4 years of an administration that politicizes it even more. In fact, the last administration came into office wanting to cut down on the backlog in immigration court. And we've seen exactly the opposite happen. It's almost doubled. I think it's at 1.5 million cases now. It started at 800,000 when the last administration took office. The last I heard, something like 14,000 of those cases are pending before our judges here in Cleveland. Let me give you a quick example of what happens when you make case law politicized. There was a famous case where a woman was enslaved by a guerrilla group in El Salvador. She was kept for years as a slave, made to cook and clean and provide for the needs of the rebel fighters. She came to the US, applied for asylum, and a court later decided that the cooking and cleaning and other services that she provided to her enslavers constituted material support to terrorism, and so she wasn't eligible for asylum. So that's what happens when you politicize our system of immigration courts. And unfortunately, there is plenty of evidence of the fact that people whose asylum claims are denied often do get killed in their home countries. One quick example, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of enforcement, a lot of raids going on in the Carolinas, and there were 5 young men specifically who were detained allegedly because they missed their court hearings while they were still children. So the question that we need to ask the administration is it a matter of national policy that we want 5 kids like this to become 5 kids like this? These are 5 escaped murderers in Central America. Or do we want them to become 5 kids like this? It is very well documented that sometimes within hours or weeks of being deported from the United States, asylum seekers can lose their lives. So we have to really decide, what is our national policy towards asylum seekers going to be, and what outcomes do we want? The conditions of detention in the United States have been atrocious, and I could spend hours telling you about the various things I've seen over the years. But the problem is, for better or worse, we are often an example to the world. And so it's not just here in the United States, but many wealthy countries all over the world are making it more and more difficult for the most desperate people to successfully petition for asylum. As of 2015, essentially the combined population of Texas and California globally is in need of asylum. They're either refugees or internally displaced. And so what we're seeing really is a systematic failure, not only of national, but of world leadership to take care of people who we have a solemn legal obligation to take care of. As I wrap up, I'll just leave you with a couple of quotes that I think sum up the situation that we're in. We are very much repeating the mistakes of the past, in that we know people who have been denied asylum by our courts and deported are actually murdered. As Pearl Buck told us, the test of a civilization is how it cares for its most helpless members. And I can tell you right now, a child in US immigration detention applying for asylum is the single most vulnerable person in our society, if you ask me. So I want to leave you with what I think is a fairly poignant image. That is the Manzanar internment camp in 1942. And below is a site which I remember like I saw it yesterday. That is the Family Detention Center in South Texas in 2014. So the big question I think for many of you might be, what can we do about it? What must we do about it? And I have a couple of action items in mind specifically. One is there is a need for asylum seekers to find housing in situations where they come here not already knowing someone or not already having a family or friends. So if you're interested in learning more about opening your house to someone, there's a local psychiatrist, Dr. Joan Lederer, who's been very generous in doing evaluations of asylum seekers, and she's putting together a group of people willing to provide housing. Our main demands for the Biden administration are you must release all currently detained families and children now. This is something that when he was still campaigning, President Biden campaigned on, and so it's time to hold him to account and make him put his money where his mouth is. Immigration detention should only be used in the most extreme cases where the government can show someone is dangerous. I can't tell you how many men I've represented over the years. For example, right now I've got a guy who's been in jail for 3 years. He has a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old at home. So he's missed half of his 6-year-old's life. He's never been convicted or accused of a crime. There's no evidence that he's dangerous or a flight risk. The government is simply not releasing him because they don't have to, and no one is forcing them to. My next suggestion is sometimes controversial depending on how you interpret it, but I really think we need to abolish ICE. We've only had ICE since 2003, and there are many other federal agencies that can much better perform the duties of ICE than what exists as ICE today. So we need to get rid of it. President Biden has said he's open to kind of piecemeal legislative reforms. I think that's fine, but there's certain things that need to be done first. Fix DACA and put people with young children in the US first in terms of getting back to the country. And as you've seen from the beginning of my presentation, we need independent immigration courts. We cannot have this highly politicized system where the attorney general, whoever that might be, handpicks judges and makes his own decisions that affect our obligations under international law. So for some local resources, the Ohio Immigrant Alliance does a great job of keeping up to speed with developments in not just immigration law, but events here in Ohio. So I would encourage you to follow them. On the east side, there's a group called Americans Making Immigrants Safe, which does a lot of great work. Cleveland Jobs with Justice. The Catholic Diocese of Cleveland is the umbrella for a group called the Northeast Ohio Rapid Response Network, which is working with various faith and community groups to train volunteers to respond to raids. On the west side, there's the Lorain Ohio Immigrants' Rights Association. So there's a lot that you can do to get involved locally. And a lot of that starts with just learning more about these issues. So I want to thank everyone for your time this morning, and thanks for inviting me. I look forward to taking questions. And with that, I guess I will turn it over to Patrick.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. I'm gonna just pop on my screen share real quick. All right, so thank you, Brian. Thanks for the introduction. Pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Patrick Kearns. I'm with the organization called the Refugee Response based in Cleveland, Ohio. Before we get started, I'm going to go through just a couple points of terminology I'm going to be talking about. The first is the word refugee. So when we use that word, what does that mean? I will be using the kind of accepted UN legal definition, meaning that people who have fled persecution, conflict, disaster from a home country into a second country that seek and then receive refugee status through a UN process. Those are the folks who typically go into what we call refugee camps or temporary shelters. Outside of that, we talk about displaced persons. So those are individuals that have fled conflict, disaster, persecution, that might not have access to a refugee camp. Which, you think about that, that's kind of a hard concept to get your head around. Is that, you know, right now there's about 26 million folks in refugee camps. There's close to 79 million displaced persons. Meaning that even in the case where you are accepted into a refugee camp, that is considered to be more fortunate than the realities that a lot of folks are facing after they've been displaced. I'm going to talk about resettled individuals, meaning and families, meaning families that were registered as refugees that have been able to come to countries like America. Primary resettlement, meaning when a first destination. So when you are going from a camp in Southeast Asia into America, your primary resettlement location, the first city you show up in. And then we'll talk about secondary migration, meaning maybe you've moved to America 2 years ago, you were settled in Tallahassee, Florida, and you decided to move to Cleveland, Ohio. And we call that secondary migration. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the slideshow. So top line numbers, as I mentioned, 79.5 million displaced persons worldwide, 27 million in refugee camps. And an important statistic to keep an eye on is that over 1/2 of those individuals are under the age of 18, meaning this is really an issue about moms and about children. And that is a particular focus that our organization takes. In 2020, the United States accepted out of that total number, 12,000 individuals, and that's nationally, 12,000. Now, the federal limit had been dropped to 15,000, and then because of COVID, it stalled the number. So we reached 12,000, which is our lowest number in the modern history of the refugee resettlement program since the time that Brian spoke about, when it really started, following World War II or on the heels of World War II. That meant in 2020, Cleveland had about 150 new arrivals. Now that is dramatically different from 2014 and 2015, where there were upwards of 1,200, 1,000 new arrivals that were coming into the city being resettled here. In 2021 to 2022, we anticipate this number to grow back, to continue back on the trend. The Biden administration has set a rather ambitious goal nationally of 125,000 new arrivals to hit per year. Now, we're not going to hit that within our first year. We're going to gradually build back towards that number. And that's largely due to the dismantling of this system, the dismantling of the resettlement system, not only here in the States, but overseas as well. That's really slowed down this process. So what we expect starting mid-year is for family reunifications to start taking place at a higher number. And largely, these are individuals that have already been passed through the system, the multi-year vetting system for refugees to come into the country. So they've been approved, they have their paperwork, they have the green light, and they have just been stalled for years right now. That's what we expect to happen first. Now, when we talk about refugee resettlement, we all know that we're in a pandemic and an economic downturn. And so there's always questions about, well, why is this a priority? Why should this be a priority for America? Why should this be a priority for Cleveland? And I like to think of it in 3 ways. First, I think it's the morally right thing to do. We have the resources to do this. And to be quite frank, the cause and root issues of many of the refugee crises around the world have been enabled or encouraged by our foreign policy wings. Secondly, I believe it's culturally right. There is a value to having the diversity of individuals and families that we bring into the city. If you are a fan of global and ethnic food, this makes a lot of sense. But it also means that in our schools, our children and our communities, they have more exposure to a wider group, a wider breadth of culture. And third, it's economically right. And this is something that we've actually proven twice now through an economic study in Cleveland, is what is the value of return for bringing in and welcoming the refugee? What we can say is that for every $1 spent, it's an $8 return to the local economy because people get jobs, they pay taxes, and usually after about a period of 2 to 3 years, they start looking into home ownership. In a city where you have a large manufacturing sector and a large shipping sector, there's a need for employees, and you have a robust and available housing stock. So where are these folks? Where are people coming from? Our organization works right now with people from about 12 different nationalities. And, roughly we can group these in the following areas: Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Nepal, Myanmar, Iraq, and Somalia. That's largely where we see most of our clients coming from. Now, outside of that, we also see a large number of secondary migrants. And I mentioned that term before. And what I mean by that are folks like this who have resettled to a different city and then decided to move to Cleveland, Ohio. Now, in 2019 and 2020, for the first time that we can note, we had a higher number of secondary migrants coming into the city than primary migrants. So that meant we had more people that were coming in from places like Santa Fe or Tallahassee to Cleveland than we had people that were coming in as a part of our national refugee resettlement program. Now, this has a lot of different implications to it because it means these folks are not necessarily receiving services when they arrive. They're not necessarily on the radar of a caseworker from a federal agency. And that's really where agencies like ours step up and work with these clients. So we meet them, we help them with housing, we help them find jobs, get into education, and then find stability from there. Well, what's important to keep in mind when we talk about refugees, when we talk about refugees in Cleveland or in general, and what I think is a crucial thing to keep in mind is that we have to understand, the human mind has a desire, has an impulse to categorize and to generalize. And it's really, common to hear, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, these terms used, and they become a blanket for an entire population, where in fact, it couldn't be further from the truth. When you work with a population like this, like immigrants or refugees, we understand that they're coming from all different kinds of backgrounds of life, right? That a generalized version, a generalized picture of these folks is not necessarily the most helpful thing to understand how to reach them. They come from different languages, different cultures, different experiences, different stabilities of government and social service, different education and different employment. So that means we have to find ways to work with them. One example that I like to highlight right now on this, this diversity is about the willingness of people or their feelings of security around vaccination this year. What we've seen is that some of the populations we work with that are from sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a history of really improper practice by pharmaceutical companies targeting local populations as testing areas, there's much greater skepticism about looking at a vaccination, right? And I believe justifiably so. That tells us our job there is slightly different on how we have to work with that population, right? Slightly different how we have to engage community leadership. Whereas you compare that to a group like the Nepalese that have been in the US for, upwards of 15 years now, and you have many individuals from that community who have gone on to graduate from university and work in the healthcare sector. They have inside of that community advocates that are promoting this to their populations, to their neighbors, and to their friends, making it a very different dynamic looking at that. So one thing that all these folks that we know have in common, and one thing that our agency tries to focus on, is that no matter where people are coming from, no matter the differences that separate them, by and large, they're here to invest in the future of their family. The parents have sacrificed for their children to be here. They've sacrificed, so much of their adult lives for their children to have a better opportunity and to grow up here, to go to school and to be successful. And what we've seen in this last year is COVID really challenged a lot of this, right? Most of our clients that are adults work in essential services. And starting in March, we saw a huge number of unemployment. And then that was coupled with the closing of daycare, the closing of schools, meaning that parents might be out of work and all of a sudden all of the kids are at home during the daytime without any release for that, without any income coming in. So those particular challenges made very, very acute stress points on the family. At the same time that all of the social services, right, all of the unemployment registration and social assistance programs moved to either online or over the phone appointments and support. That made overwhelmingly most of those services inaccessible for the populations we work with. the language support was almost nothing for the agencies, and it became a huge challenge that agencies like ours and many other partners had to rise up to meet. We did massive distributions of food. We focused on getting people into jobs and worked with a wide variety of communities that then, did distributions that assisted in this way. And, I'm very happy to say that even though we are by no means out of the woods on this situation, we did not see any family lose their housing. And we've seen every client that we've worked with that's come into our program who lost a job, get a job. No children have dropped out of school, and all of our high school seniors that are on our course this year are due to graduate in time. So while there's challenges, I really believe that a bedrock has been built to assist in all manner of different ways to make sure that things do not fall through the cracks. Now, this is going to be so important, not only this year, but as our new arrival numbers start to increase locally. And I do want to end on a quick, because I know we're short on time, so I've kind of blown through this. So thank you for listening to me. But I do want to end on a couple positive notes here. And I mentioned the teenagers we work with, and we did a project this year where, with all of our high school kids, we loaned out Polaroid disposable digital cameras, and we asked them to try to capture some images from their home lives. What are they seeing during this time of isolation? What are they seeing during this time where they're not with their friends at school? And just I wanted to share some of these images. And what I really take from this is that outside of the differences of where people are coming from, there's not a lot of difference to what happens in all of our homes. It's a focus on family. It's a focus on being with each other. And for our young adults we work with, it's a focus on finding out what their identity is and how they're adjusting to these challenging times moving forward. So with that, I do want to stop there. I know we are moving into the next session, but I just wanted to thank everybody. And while we're kind of talking, I wanted to mention from Brian's talk, one thing that really struck to me was when he mentioned the ship of the damned. And I recall in 2016 reading some articles about what was the popular support around new arrivals of Syrian children. Like, what was the public opinion on that, of taking Syrian children as refugees? And it was exactly the same figure from that period of time during the run up to World War II, the popular opinion on taking Jewish children as refugees. It was 61% of the population was against taking children that were fleeing persecution. So history does repeat itself, it seems, Brian.
You're exactly right, Patrick. And in fact, I'm so glad that you and I got to present on this panel together, because these two issues, protecting refugees and protecting asylum seekers, are so closely related. And just to clarify for everybody, really the only technical distinction between an asylum seeker and a refugee is where you apply. Patrick mentioned that there are refugee camps in certain parts of the world where, if you happen to be nearby, you can go there and apply for status. But as far as I know, there are no UN-operated refugee camps in the Western Hemisphere. So, and there are very specific geopolitical reasons for that, right? Which a whole seminar could be taught on. But so if you are from Nicaragua, say, there's no camp for you to go to. The only way to seek status in the US is to apply for asylum, which must be done in the US or at the US border. There's nothing you can mail from Managua. There's no embassy you can go to. You have to come to the US and apply for asylum. And as I said at the beginning, we have international legal obligations to protect these people, which I think are kind of chicanery with our systems of implementation is thwarting. Patrick, I just wanted to ask you, I've had people for years and years going through the immigration court system, but what's the longest you ever had somebody wait in a camp before they were resettled? I'm sure it's...
20 years. People. So in 2002, I lived in a refugee camp in northern Thailand, and that camp has now been there for 42 years, which is almost the same amount of time that I've been alive. And you've had multiple generations move into the camp, born, grow up, have families, have children. Those children grow up and, get married and live in the refugee camp. So, when we talk about the number of, the release valve of resettlement is so small, right? Not just in the US, which is, tiny, but globally, the release valve is small, meaning that these camps are generally just, year by year, they're getting larger and they're getting larger because, people are, they're having families, they're getting married, they're starting their lives in a refugee camp.
I want to thank both of our speakers. It was so informative, and I have to say, also very touching to hear your presentations. And now it's time for questions and answers. We have quite a few questions already. I will mention once more that you can find the Q&A button. If you have a PC, it's probably at the bottom of your screen. If you have a tablet or a smartphone, it could be in another location. Speaking of computer buttons, I also want to mention the chat button. Go to the chat button if you're not already on our forum list and you would like to receive information about new forums that we're going to have in the future. So now, Debbie Wright, a member of our forum committee, and I will direct your questions to our speakers. And Debbie will ask the first question.
Okay, well, we have a lot of questions, some very specific, some general. I must admit, listening to both your talks, I can't believe how complicated it must be to be a refugee and apply as a refugee or to apply for asylum. I mean, there's so many agencies involved, I can't imagine who you go to. And so I'm just going to start with the real general question, but I would like to get at some point to that question of who actually provides these services on the ground when a person arrives in a city. I lived in Western Wisconsin in a rural area, and in the 80s, we had a lot of refugees from Thailand coming out, among people coming out of the refugee camps in Thailand. And in those days, there was the Lutheran Social Services and the Lutheran churches, and they adopted these people and helped them settle. So there was a face in this rural community and employers who had jobs to give these people. And so there's a coordinated effort within that community to resettle these refugees. I feel like if I come here to Cleveland, who helps me,
So I could jump in on that first on the refugee side.
And who pays the people who help you, or maybe are they not paid? Are they volunteers? How does that whole system work?
All across the board, every shape and form you can imagine. So I just want to zoom out real quickly, and for the refugee resettlement industry, there are 9 national agencies that have contracts with the government to do the resettlement, right? So that's meeting people off the plane and their first 90 days. Lutheran Family Services is one of those 9. So Lutheran Family Services will be operational in cities across the country. Here in Cleveland, we actually have 3 national agencies that do that resettlement work. And they'll take an allocation of new arrivals per year, and they have that mandate with that first 90-day package to make sure that families get here, that they get into English language programs if they need it. They get into housing, they get into education.
And who decides what cities they go to? Is that a government decision or a personal decision by the refugee?
It can be both. So if you have a particular connection, a family connection to someone who's already been resettled, when you go through your interview process overseas, you can stipulate that. And there's a good chance that you will be connected with your family because it's been proven to make sense. It's been proven, to be successful. But other than that, it's done on a quota basis across the states. So you'll have states, counties, and then cities will put a bid in for how many people that they think they can accept on an annual basis. The federal government then looks at that with the total number of new arrivals expected over the year and apportions them out across the country that way. So it's a little bit of everything. I'll say this, generally, Ohio is a supportive state for resettling refugees. The governor signed a letter in 2020, still, supporting this to go forward. Cuyahoga County always puts forward a larger number than we actually receive because we've seen the value in resettling. So there is that intentionality here. But outside of that, like after that 90-day or that, slightly over 90-day point, then it's local agencies like mine. It's legal agencies like, that might be called in for like Brian and his work, it's church groups. And, there is always an army of volunteers in the hundreds that, we work with about 300 volunteers a year that get paired with individuals. And, there's always a need for that. So it's a little mix of everything. And, Cleveland's been really, I'd say, a great city at an individual level to step up to this kind of work.
Just to add briefly to that, it gets at this distinction again between what is a refugee and what is an asylum seeker, because all of that money that goes to these various agencies is contingent on you being designated a refugee already, usually by an interview process that takes place in the camp. So if you're from Central America, you could have the exact same political or religious persecution problems as somebody in Africa, but you have no camp. So you come up to the US border where you're considered an asylum seeker, and there is no federal funding essentially to meet the needs of people whose asylum applications are pending. So there are nonprofits that individually seek out private grants and do various, community funding models. But as terrible as it is to be a refugee, I look at these asylum seekers I work with sometimes and go, gosh, the refugees have it so much better off. Somebody meets them at the airport, takes them to an apartment, shows them around. We have people who basically just get put in handcuffs and put in jail for the first time in their lives, and then spend months there trying to convince the judge that they have somewhere else to go. And that was my second point. So if you're arrested applying for asylum and put in detention, you have to convince a government official that you are not dangerous and that you are not a flight risk, again, that the burden is on you. So many people who come to the US to seek asylum do have family members somewhere, whether it's your uncle or your godfather or whoever. And part of the work that we do as lawyers is you get all kinds of documentation from that person saying, here's where I'm going to go. I'm not going to run away. I'm going to show up for court. And even then, the clients sometimes are paying $10,000 to $15,000 cash bonds to be released from jail so that they can apply for asylum from outside of detention. So yeah, the federal money that exists for refugees, I mean, there's nothing like that for asylum seekers when they essentially have the same problem.
Wow. So then there's at the mercy of whatever local community they end up in to see if there's help available there or their family. How can we address the immigration and world destabilization, refugee and climate issues when no one is talking about addressing the world's population growth? This is a question from Eileen. And is this just a population growth problem, or is it really a climate change, political destabilization issue?
I would actually call it more of a wealth inequality problem than a population problem. I just don't think it's the case that we've reached anywhere near, the Malthusian carrying capacity of the planet, or whatever you want to call it. But when you look at people who are deciding which one of their 8 yachts they're going to have to sell to meet the margin on their recent unsuccessful day trades, and then you've got refugees who grow up and get married and have children in camps with no plumbing. It's just not the case that we can't take care of all of the people who we share the planet with. It's that we're choosing not to.
Jim asking, what can we do as a society? And just because our congregation is very active with social issues, what can UCC do to improve our systems for processing applications of potential immigrants? I'll add to that, what about these 12,000 pending cases? So in a legal level, what about these that are so difficult to process through our system as well?
Patrick, I'll let you take that one. I don't know specifically what application. I mean, I know the Unitarian Church does its own kind of resettlement program, but.
Yeah. So I mean, I won't speak to the legal application side on the asylum. I think that's Brian is definitely the authority in that side of it. But I'll say in terms of what the UU community can do. Well, I mean, there's the personal side, right? Which is, the reaching out to agencies that are working here There's the advocacy side. One thing that I'm encouraged about is, let's be completely honest. People were asking me in the last 4 years, like, what can we do to change the policy? What can we do to advocate? And, the reality was nothing. The policies were being made at the federal level. They were being made by an administration that had no interest, no desire to listen to fact-based information or to advocate on behalf of newcomers. So, as Brian, I think, very eloquently, put this, is like, that power on immigration rests in the executive branch, right? So it's not, you can have a state senator, or you can have a governor that's supportive, but if you can't get past that initial policy decision at the executive level, it doesn't really matter. Now, I think we're in a different environment right now. And so what I would say going forward is that, in Ohio, it's, working with our state senators like Sherrod Brown and working with our governor, who still supports the arrival of newcomers, to make sure that Ohio is not moving in a direction like Texas, where they are opting out of this policy. So that was one convention that the previous administration put in. The states could opt out of being a part of this, which I think is legally very questionable. But that became a precedent. So I would say, starting with there, what's that policy for states opting in and opting out? And one thing that really bothered me about that is that wasn't based on the cities, the constituents, or the counties in those states. It was based on a political calculation that the governor took in relation to the administration. Because the reality is, those cities and counties, the reason they had refugees resettled there before is because they put in a bid and expressed interest for that, and they have the ability to accept people. So I think now I'm very hopeful that we can move away from this fog of, this fog of misinformation, and really then work on advocacy channels as we have in the past.
Did you have anything to add, Brian, to that?
No, I completely agree with Patrick on pretty much everything, it sounds like.
So this is sort of a follow-up related question. With President Biden's executive order to remedy the unresolved immigration issue, both at the border and within the United States, in other words, DACA, do you see the Senate undermining his action by delaying the confirmation of Alejandro Mayorkas, I don't know how to pronounce that name, Biden's nominee for the for the Secretary of Homeland Security? And I guess also, should this be an executive decision, or should this be Senate passed new law, or the legislature passed new laws?
So there's a lot to unpack there. Let me go to the confirmation question first. My understanding is they voted to break the filibuster on Thursday, so Mayorkas will probably be confirmed by tomorrow night as DHS secretary. And I think he's definitely a good compromise pick. He, served in the Obama administration, and Obama, let's be honest, was not great for a lot of important immigration issues. But Mayorkas is kind of a centrist who I think has the technical experience to get the job done. What President Biden has done through executive orders so far is he has canceled the Remain in Mexico program, the program that essentially turned Tijuana, the streets of Tijuana, into a refugee camp. But the people who are in Tijuana now are being told to remain there until some new DHS program is established. So in a way, I don't think he deserves all of that much credit yet, because he says we're ending this terrible program, but hang on, we're going to figure out what to do instead. He also extended DACA, but with the original requirements. So you still have to have entered the US as of, I forget how many years ago, and been under 16. So it's not really, it doesn't cover anyone who it wouldn't have already covered under President Obama. It's just been reactivated by the president. So I really don't think the executive orders have taken care of the situation at the border. There's steps in the right direction, but we have essentially a refugee camp on the streets of Tijuana that was created by illegal US government policies. And there's a lot of cleaning up that needs to be done down there. I'm hearing that Secretary Mayorkas and Dr. Jill Biden might both be on a presidential commission on family reunification. I think that would be wonderful. But there are so many families who are separated right now because their family members are stuck in Tijuana seeking asylum, and they can't even physically get into the US to submit their asylum application. So putting pressure on Biden to do what he told us he was going to do, I think is a responsibility we all share now. hold him accountable for his campaign promises and see if we can get him even more on the right side of this issue.
We need the Senate and the legislature to make laws that are better. I mean, shouldn't that be where we should be working at?
So the calculation between what you can do by executive order and what you need to do through legislation has sort of changed over the last 4 years, as we saw, President Trump do things through executive actions that you didn't necessarily know were constitutional before and might not be. But I think there's a lot Biden can do and should do. He should go as far as he can through executive orders. But fundamentally, you're right. You need legislative changes. The Immigration and Nationality Act needs to be completely rewritten.
I mean, immigration is such a huge complex of many moving parts. To have it change every 4 years is not sustainable.
Well, and the last president who was really good on immigration was Reagan. So it's been a long time coming that we really need to kind of, burn this whole thing down and start over is kind of the mantra.
And Anne has a question, and then we'll go to Laura. Often we hear that our ancestors came here legally, so people today should do so too. Aside from asylum seekers, could someone talk about the different immigration process or the different processes of immigrants coming here at the turn of the century versus now, at the turn of the 20th century versus now?
I mean, sure. Yeah. I don't necessarily think that's an apples to apples scenario is where I would start with. I think that was a very different time. I think there were different racial demographics that were taken into consideration when we had those new, immigrants come into the country in the turn of the century. You can look at Cleveland, right, in particular, and there's a reason that Cleveland has certain neighborhoods or certain parts of the city named after populations that arrived in the turn of the century. So Irishtown Bend is called that way for a reason, right? So that largely, and I don't want to make any, grand sweeping statements here, but largely it was a different immigration process. It was a different arrival process. It was a different population density of cities. It was a different demand for labor, and it was a different type of opportunity that people were seeking. This has become very politicized and has become a part of our federal government to allocate this and to make decisions, as opposed to a process where it was basically arrival at a border and then determinations at that point. So, I don't necessarily want to make an apples to apples situation. I would say, that a lot of, I'll come back to a point I tried to make at the top of my presentation is with a lot of these folks that are seeking refugee status or asylum seekers right now, part of the reason, and I don't mean everything, but part of the reason that they're seeking this has directly to do with some of our international policies, has directly to do with some of our policies with, our international statecraft in the past 40, 50 years. And I think we have a certain amount of, hard looking in a mirror and taking responsibility for that and understanding that when we make decisions and we make calculations, these have real human consequences. And what I've really been, I'd say, disgusted by in the past several years is the inability to look at taking responsibility for some of these decisions and saying, we're going to get involved in a place like Syria, or we're going to get involved in a place like Iraq. And then our policy becomes, well, we're going to pull out, and it doesn't matter, we don't want people to come in, or we don't want to take applications from that. Where, we went through a process of over a decade of, radically changing the face of that area and radically changing the stability of that area, and then saying that we're not responsible for it. So, I guess my feeling is, when my great grandparents came to America, they came under a very different circumstance than people that are, fleeing persecution or fleeing the fact that their father was arrested and tortured in Syria for being, on the wrong team or being a part of a certain tribe or part of a certain allegiance. I don't see it as an apples to apples scenario right now.
Okay.
I want to add real quickly to that, because to put a finer point on it, I wish I had the exact number, but between 1880 and 1920, something like 30 million Europeans immigrated to the United States, and we had no immigration controls at all during that time. There were no legal requirements for them to apply for a visa in advance, other than, I think, not having an obvious communicable disease and answering some questions about whether you were intending to work as a prostitute. But essentially, anybody from Europe could come to the US and live here permanently with very little scrutiny. So as a lawyer, I can tell you that one of the major problems with the laws is that they're made up by lawyers. We need people who actually feel the impact of these laws and policies to have a say in creating them. Our entire Immigration and Nationality Act right now is a train wreck. And the only reason that people are called, all these horrible epithets, illegals and wetbacks, things are illegal because the law says so. We can just change the law.
Yeah, and Brian, you had, talked about before when we look at, what's the role of Congress. And, I think you rightly said the last time we saw any real traction was during the Reagan administration. And, just what we're already seeing and what I'm kind of concerned about is that the conversation right now is already pivoting towards, well, what's happening in 2022 elections, right? That is, our politics and our discussion is not around policy matters. It's on power broking. And, is there going to be even time or even room to have these conversations like immigration reform that, rightfully do need to be written into law and addressed that way? But I mean, I don't know, Brian, what are the odds? Like, I mean, I hate to sound pessimistic because I'm not pessimistic by nature, but the ability of our, Congress to sort anything out right now, I just don't feel great about it.
I think Biden's approach to his willingness to do some of this piecemeal is right, because in order to pass some big comprehensive immigration reform bill, which is really what we need, you need the political will in Congress, and it's just not there. I mean, Congress doesn't even have the political will to run the country and save us all from a deadly pandemic. So thinking that they're going to do something about, these poor refugees might be a bit naive. But there is a lot of really small individual measures. There's 2 or 3 sections of the INA where if you just delete them, thousands and thousands of families will be able to get their moms and dads back. So carving it up into these kind of tinier actions might be a way to get things done more successfully. But in terms of comprehensive reform, I think you need gerrymandering reform and you need campaign finance reform before you ever get to immigration reform. Because when you have members of Congress who represent districts that were specifically drawn for them, and they have unlimited dark money to spend getting reelected, what do they care about any of these little kids who are dying in ages?
I have a question that's actually not political at all. It's about Ohio City Farms. From what I understand, what I read is that the refugee response has in the past received about 25% of its income from the sales at Ohio City Farms of organic produce to local restaurants. So I'm wondering what happened in 2020, given COVID-19 and the closure of a lot of restaurants or restaurants having smaller hours. What happened, Patrick?
So, I'll say this, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, we were more reliant on sales to restaurants for our income. So the Ohio City Farm, we do operate as I would say an authentic social enterprise, meaning that it runs on its sales volume. It doesn't have grants that support it for its running costs. So, we were probably about 60% of our sales in 2016 were focused on restaurants. And we saw that there was a lot of volatility in that, and we started to change that model, and we radically increased our amount of CSAs, which is our community supported agriculture, which is our membership program. So we went from about 60 CSAs to this year, 300 CSA members. And right now, it's the CSA structure that has allowed us to remain viable. So that is, I'd say, where 80% of our sales are coming from right now in the Ohio City Farm is our membership program. And then we added in a fall membership, we added in a flower membership, and then we still deliver to restaurants, but that volume really dipped down in the last couple of years, which I hate what happened to the restaurant industry in this last year. But I will say, it was a little bit of a silver lining for us that we had already moved that way in previous years, so it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a big challenge for us to overcome at that time. So, our sustainability for that program really relies on individual members that we work with.
Thank you. Here's another question that's not political also. Catherine asks, have you found difficulty with helping immigrants find culturally informed trauma services? But I would also include language and education services also. And how do you go about that? Who's providing it?
Yes, absolutely. Mental health services have been very, very challenging. So there's a couple that, we work with a group at Catholic Charities that does that. But it doesn't have right now the capacity, right, for the number of cases that we work with. And what we've definitely seen in a gap is working with young adults. Providing mental health services to teenagers and young adults is a real gap. And, we can make referrals, but, just the idea of having, going to an outside person you don't know in a different language, it hasn't really been that successful to make referrals on that case. So, that's an area that we really want to look at in this coming year, and especially as numbers are going to increase more and more. And we want to look at ways where we can allow that to happen in small groups, in peer groups, with support groups that are led by a trained counselor in that way. So we are hopeful that goes in that direction. But mental health services has been a huge challenge. And our clients, they're coming from histories of trauma, and some of that trauma is really recent. And then, what happens after you're here in 6 months, and now what is this place we're in? And the newness of being here goes away, and then it becomes, it becomes actually more challenging after a year or 2 years that people are here, because the newness is gone, but all that past reality is still there. So that's something we really want to focus on.
Mm-hmm. And how about your translation or language learning services?
So typically that's all right. So, we are very fortunate to have the ability to hire people from the communities we work with that are, amazing, that, are able to talk to our families in their home languages, are able to coordinate services. That isn't as much of an issue for us. Of course, it's always going to be an issue when you're working with large institutions and large bureaucracies about how do you get connections in those places. But for us to be able to communicate and deliver services, that's been, we've made a lot more progress in that area than potentially on where we need to go next with mental health services.
But then the asylum seekers, they're not eligible for some of these services, or?
So we have a couple of groups in Ohio where we've been pretty successful in getting forensic evaluations for people who are seeking asylum, to basic mental health or psychological evaluations, sometimes even for detainees. But yeah, ongoing psychotherapy is almost impossible to find, and everybody needs it. And yeah, like we were saying earlier, if you're if you're applying for asylum and that process might go on for 3 or 4 years, you might not even qualify for a work permit, and so you're supposed to just, like Olivia de Havilland and Gone with the Wind, you're just supposed to depend on the kindness of strangers, right? I mean, how do they expect you to survive? So yeah, there's no provision for mental health services, certainly, and there isn't even enough, I think, even if the money were there. So if there's any young folks watching this, become a Spanish-speaking therapist. You will be employed for the rest of your career and make all kinds of money. There's going to be a huge need for that.
Ed is asking, are there opportunities locally for those interested in helping? And it's interesting, Brian, that he also said with intermediate Spanish, or I guess we could broaden that to say with knowledge of other languages as well, or with just good English and willingness to help. How can we help? And I think this may be our last question. It's coming on to 10:35-ish.
I'll say there's lots of groups that have volunteer programs. I've been able to work with a lot of great nonprofits in Ohio, the International Institute of Akron, Catholic Charities in Cleveland. A lot of community groups like the Akron Interfaith Immigrant Alliance also have volunteer programs. The big question is, what specifically do volunteers want to bring to the table? Because a lot of times people just need rides to court. But a lot of times we do need, somebody who speaks Spanish who isn't going to charge us an hourly rate for interpretation. There's lots of logistical stuff that the various legal services orgs have volunteers helping with photocopies and things. So I would say contact your local organizers.
My own experience is Spanish is not a single language, and so a translator who speaks a certain Spanish may not help you with a patient or person from certain Central American countries where they don't necessarily speak Spanish even.
Well, and like Patrick said, there's a lot of access to interpreters. If depending on how much you can afford, there's subscription-based
Oh, yeah.
services you can use. But if you don't have any funding for that, a lot of times you're just trying to find somebody in the community who will volunteer a couple hours of their time. When I took the bar exam, I think the pass rate was like 85%. When I took the interpreter certification exam, it was 20. Because a lot of people think, oh, I'm bilingual, I can be a court interpreter. And it's really a lot more technical and difficult than that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anything to say about that, Patrick?
Oh, yeah, I would just say there's so many ways to get involved. And there's also ways to get involved that I would say meet any need you or interest you might have. So purchasing, like being a member of our farm is a way to support local jobs. This year our farm is hitting an average minimum wage of $14.60 for our farm workers, which is I think we're pretty proud of, in that it's vastly different than your standard wage for an agriculture worker in this area. That's a way to get involved. Going and eating at a restaurant that was started by a refugee or immigrant, that's a way to get involved, as well as being a tutor or a mentor. And if you go to our website, therefugeeresponse.org, we have a very interactive menu that takes you through different options where you can be a volunteer. You can be a transportation volunteer, you can be a tutor, you can be an in-person tutor, an online tutor. There are a lot of different opportunities if you're looking to plug in. And one thing is, like, we started, because of COVID, we do a lot of online tutoring, which we did in person before. And that's meant that we have tutors now that are from all across the states. We have tutors that are in Puerto Rico that are part of our program. And it's been pretty awesome, and it's super flexible to work that way. So, don't think that there's not ways that we can accommodate volunteers, even though you're still worried about going outside and with the pandemic.
It looks like Brian has put some contact information of his on chat, and you could do that as well, Patrick, since people have several people have made comments that they would like to be of assistance or find out how we can assist more. And if you want to also put some of the organizations in chat for people, that would be really appreciated. And we so much appreciate our speakers today, Patrick Kearns and Brian Hoffman, for an excellent presentation. We appreciate your expertise and the commitment to this important work that you both do. Reminder to everybody, if you're interested in receiving more information about upcoming forums and you're not already on our mailing list, please put your email address and name in chat. We already have received quite a few today. So next Sunday, February 7th, the forum is entitled Community Safety Challenges, Oversight, and Reforms. Nationally, there's talk about defunding police and reallocating funds to social service agencies. How can communities better handle low-level misdemeanors, keep more people out of jail, and improve racial relations? What's happening locally? Our speakers are Daniel Flannery from Case Western University and also director of Begin Center for Violence Prevention, David Weiss, Mayor of Shaker Heights, and Carol Ballard, Director of Education and Training, the Adams Board of Cuyahoga County. This forum today has been recorded, and it will soon be available on our Unitarian website, uucleveland.org. We want to invite all of you now to our virtual Unitarian service at 11 o'clock this morning. Go to our website at uucleveland.com and look for today's date. We look forward to seeing you again for a forum next Sunday. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.